Thank you and welcome everybody. Thank you for attending today's Healthcare IT News webinar, Dark Web and Ransomware Realities, Stopping Attackers Cold with Hybrid Cloud Solutions, sponsored by Evolve IP. Again, my name is Beth Sanborn. I'm the Managing Editor of Healthcare Finance News, and I will be your moderator today. We certainly look forward to everyone's questions and comments, and you can submit them at any time by accessing the question box on your screen. We'll make every effort to get to them following the presentation during the Q&A. Ransomware and dark web email vulnerabilities have created about a $1 billion industry for cyber criminals. Many unwanted infiltrations stem from compromised email credentials on the dark web, and in fact, 63% of breaches in the U.S. last year were the result of a compromised email account, making protection and recoverability paramount. During today's webinar, you'll see current analysis of healthcare credentials on the dark web and hear how to successfully avoid ransomware damage with a rock-solid cloud-based business continuity plan. Our speakers for today's webinar include Kevin Lancaster, CEO at ID Agent, Rick Vanover, Director of Technical Product Marketing and Evangelism at Veeam Software, Scott Kinka, Chief Technical and Product Development Officer at Evolve IP, and Virju Patel, Senior Sales Engineer at Nimble Storage. Some of today's discussion points or topics will include an overview of the ransomware epidemic, which we all know is, in fact, quite rampant, dark web insights from ID Agent, best practices for ransomware protection, solutions from Evolve IP, Nimble, and Veeam, and ransomware recovery case studies. We'll start it off with Kevin Lancaster. Kevin, you now have the floor.
Thank you. Good afternoon, and thank you to Evolve for hosting today. My name is Kevin Lancaster. I'm the CEO of ID Agent. We support organizations and look for data, PII, PHI, all kinds of data out there on the dark web that can be used in a malicious manner to exploit an organization. So we look for it and we report and we help protect our customers, and they include government agencies, healthcare organizations, consumer brands, down to small SMBs. So I'll go over real quick kind of a trend line here over with regard to ransomware, touch on some statistics around the dark web, a couple screenshots, screen shares, and then I'll turn it over to Scott Kinka. But to start off, you can see just the trend line here over the last couple of years. The volume of exploit, the volume of ransomware is increasing dramatically. In 2015, DOJ estimated there's about 1,000 ransomware attacks in the U.S. daily. That was up to about 4,000 in 2016, and 2017 it's estimated just over 10,000 unique attacks daily in the U.S. Some organizations or industries are attacked more frequently than others for obvious reasons. With healthcare in particular, the value of PHI data is 50 to 60 times more valuable than financial data. So healthcare organizations are targeted increasingly just because of the value and the longevity of PHI and different identifiable information that can be extracted and exploited. So you see just over the last couple of years, the volume is increasing dramatically, and the targeting and the activities are increasing dramatically. Next slide. You know, everyone's by now has heard of WannaCry and a lot of the hysteria, and a lot of it was rightfully so, but the hysteria around WannaCry and the exploits that the shadow brokers have been dripping here over the last several months. The interesting thing about the shadow brokers and their ability to drip this data is that, WannaCry is one tool out of 300 megabytes of materials that was extracted from the NSA and is out there and will be dripped and will be utilized, unfortunately, for nefarious reasons here over the coming years. And so this is certainly adding to the epidemic of ransomware and other malware-based exploits. Next slide. Why is this happening? As I mentioned, a moment ago, that particularly as it relates to the healthcare space, PHI in some circles is the holy grail of data. A lot of it is highly valuable, highly exploitable. A lot of the data that is extracted or held for ransom includes Social Security numbers, dates of birth, maiden names, things that aren't very easily replaceable. Financial data, it is a pain, obviously, and it's just a headache in general to deal with if you have a financial exploit. But you're talking about a credit card. It's insured. It can be replaced, but you can't necessarily replace your Social Security number, your date of birth, your mother's maiden name. These things last with you forever. And so the value of that type of data combined with real health data makes it very attractive and highly sought after. And so one little typo on this slide, I apologize, but there are billions of credentials out there in the dark web. Unfortunately, there are, out of the billions, probably half of the data that we see is fictitious or repurposed data, but even taking that data out after we do some level of attribution, there still are billions of compromised credentials. And on a daily basis, we're seeing, tens to hundreds of thousands of fresh credentials that are being harvested through various means. Other reasons why this is happening, the challenges, a lot of it is really user-based, human error. A lot of these compromises that are out there are based on credential exploits. It was mentioned that at the start at 63%, now probably closer to 67% of breaches over the last 12 months were a result of a compromised or oftentimes weak or default password exploit. And so, this data is published out in various areas, various forms, and it's very easily accessible by bad actors. And so, apologize, let's advance one more slide here. This is just a snapshot of one of our monitoring platforms. When we're looking for credentials, we're looking at trends, we're looking at different areas where we're finding data, harvesting, and then reporting. We'll often work with an organization and then put multiple domains, put their supply chain domains in there, maybe even organizations that they team with. And we'll put the domains in there, and we'll show trend lines over the last 12 months, 24 months, 36 months, just to show them what's going on within their populations. And so that's a screenshot there. And I'll wrap up here with one more screenshot. Let's see my connection here. This last screenshot is an actual view of credentials that we would find and we would report on. And so this is just a sample of a handful of domains. But in general, when we find data that matches a customer's domain or supply chain domain, partner domain, we'll alert that we have that data. Customer will log in, or sometimes we'll tie into their Active Directory to automate that process. Show them the password, show them whether it matches their password strength or criteria, and we'll show them source attribution when required. And so with that, I want to thank you for your time, and I want to turn it over to Scott Kinka, Chief Technical and Product Development Officer with Evolve IP. Scott?
Thanks, Kevin. I appreciate it. And I want to thank Veeam for pulling this slide together. We've given them a little attribution there in the bottom left as well. We want to share just a few statistics with you. You heard Kevin talking about people, and people, you'll find that much of the remainder of this presentation continues to harken back to the fact that the dark web and then, how it's manifested in ransomware is really a scenario that you can't necessarily engineer against. People are still the intrusion point. So let me share with you a bit of information. 1 out of every 2 breaches are the result of insecure employee behaviors. A little bit of color on that statement is you'd actually have to know you had a breach to actually have it be considered in that statistic, which implies that it's actually significantly higher. The average phishing email attack success rates of untrained staff is 60%, and trained staff is 20%. 50% of users open emails and click links within the first hour. So for those of you who aren't familiar with a lot of the jargon we're tossing around, phishing is the fake email to your end user saying, hey, you need to log back in here to put your credentials in, pretending it's eBay or some other site like that they may be focusing on. This is an important statement that we're going to be making throughout the presentation, that training is an incredibly important portion of the resolution here. Training's big, but it's also not foolproof. Let's move down to the bottom left there. Cyber criminals don't just go after big companies. In 2014, 59% of all targeted attacks were aimed at companies with fewer than 2,500 employees, 34% fewer than 250 employees. What's really interesting about this, and that was a statistic from Symantec, is that most directs aren't actually targeted at a company at all. They're just targeted to groups of IPs or groups of users, and that credential information is made available on the dark web. So the whole idea that, hey, I'm small, so I'm not necessarily a target, is a complete misnomer. Basically, these are human-engineered attacks at blocks of email addresses and blocks of IP addresses for other scanning on things like servers and desktops, and it's just designed to to essentially trick end users into sharing credentials. Robert Mueller, the former FBI director, who's making a few waves right now in federal government circles, stated there are only two types of companies, those that have been hacked and those that will be. Even that is merging into one category. Those have been hacked and will be again. And that's really kind of the focus of this next section. So I'm going to just advance ahead here. Why is this such a particularly difficult challenge? The first is we talk about this type of attack or infiltration being a no broken glass found type of infiltration. And that's because at the end of the day, this is targeted at extracting keys. There's no reason to break the glass if you can just let yourself in the front door easily. We just had the concept of the dark web explained. The credentials are kiddied out there for all the bad actors to go grab. People remain the biggest risk. So, two biggest issues, phishing scams we talked about is email and same or similar passwords. I don't have the statistics at my immediate disposal, but, with an average 75% of credentials that are typically used by end users are the same or similar to other credentials they've used. And in many times, those, it's the password on eBay or on Facebook is similar to the network password, right? So certainly stolen credentials are the easiest path in. If you have a key, you don't have to break the glass. And you did just see the exponentially increasing amount of attacks. So the real question is, what can you truly do to prevent ransomware? That's ultimately the question. So let's move on to some of the experts. The FBI, in terms of the response to this threat, has consistently stated that they don't support actually paying the ransom for a whole host of reasons. Obviously, success breeds future attacks, certainly. And then, frankly, passing cash over doesn't necessarily mean that you'd be, alleviated from the challenge anyway. The Cyber Division Assistant Director, James Traynor, said there's no one method or tool that will completely protect you or your organization from a ransomware attack. But contingency and remediation planning is crucial to business recovery and continuity, and these plans should be tested regularly. This is an interesting tonal statement. Notice it wasn't about mitigating an attack from happening, but it was about mitigating the result. Ransomware is really about expecting to have a problem and being properly positioned for recovery. And we're going to talk a lot today about methodologies for recovery, because that's really what this is about. If you get down to the specific keys to protection that they're delivered by the FBI, interesting that it starts with data backup. Not some kind of crazy perimeter security, not something that you can do on email, not training and education, but back up your data regularly. Verify the integrity of the backups, secure them, and then isolate them on computers that are separate from the networks in which they protect. And obviously, our case today is to imply that one of those places would be towards the cloud. And we'll be talking about, with our partners here, Veeam and Nimble, options to do that into Evolve IP's cloud. So what are the best practices for killing ransomware? This is sort of the Evolve IP stance. The first is proactive threat intelligence. So vulnerability monitoring, that is a techie thing, right? That's the service. That's, it's in STEM. It's in being vigilant on what's going on in the network. This is something that is being done by the IT department. But in that fold is also employee education. People need to know how to look out for the types of phishing attacks and need to be essentially, they need to understand the same similar password problem. And again, the training and education really only decreases rates from 50 to 20%. in terms of the success of those types of attacks. The second piece would be active security management. WannaCry is a really good example. The first statement here is continuous upgrades, patching, and environmental response. There was all kinds of outcry in the media after the WannaCry piece, virus and malware and ransomware became rampant a few weeks ago. What most people chose not to talk about was the fact that the only real defense for this was in patching desktops and servers. This wasn't a security scenario as much as it was a responsible administration scenario. And all that goes towards ongoing awareness, the diligence to understand what's going on inside the network. So what is it you can do? This almost sounds like an oxymoron. We do it on purpose, but a strong reactive posture. And we say that because we've talked a lot about how proactive isn't necessarily the order of the day in a ransomware protection situation. So this is really about your incident response capability. First and foremost, you have to get backups off-site, and if possible, you have to have the data replicated, and we'll talk about why that's important in a moment. You also importantly have to have the ability to recover that data from multiple points. Think about this. You basically have to find the point at which somebody clicked the button, and you have to go back to the closest point before that to truly get yourself into a recovery situation. And then you have to plan for guaranteed business continuity. What do you mean by continuity? Not just can you get your data back, but how quickly will it take for you to be operating in a fashion that you're essentially back in business, because we can't 100% prevent it. So let's kind of give you a little bit of a pictorial on strong reactive posture. I want to introduce two concepts first. The first is RTO, which is Recovery Time Objective. Recovery Time Objective is how quickly your data is back in a usable format. Before RTO is RPO, which is Recovery Point. That is, how old is the data that I'm restoring? And I mention those two things because your continuum of options in this reactive posture going from left to right address those individual timeframes uniquely. So if we start with, hey, I've got a premise backup, I'm taking tapes here, and then we move into a multi-site premise backup, so from one of my data centers to the next data center. That's addressed the number of copies, but depending on when we took backup, we may have proliferated, frankly, the ransomware threat into the other backup. It also doesn't really address the RTO or RPO of the solution, which we'll get to in a minute. So now businesses begin to look at, in the third box there, beginning to move those backups off-site. And this moves us from the in-production data center backup to getting a copy into the data center. Now, what this does is protects us, obviously, from local issues, but we still have to make sure that we're addressing the RTO, RPO. So let me move to the next step, and this will make some sense. Replicating to the cloud enables you to take either moment by moment or snapshot copies of data over the course of the day, not just at a backup window at the end of the day or midday. What this addresses is essentially your recovery point. This says, I've got multiple times throughout the day that I could restore my data from. So if Dave, who's sitting across from the table from me, happened to click on an email, a nefarious email that got ransomware running inside the network at 120, I need to look and say, hey, do I have a point around 110 where I could easily get a restoral to? So that's addressing RPO. What it doesn't address is RTO, which gets us to cloud recoverable services and then ultimately managed DR. And what that says is, okay, I have a copy of my data. It's only 10 minutes before or a few minutes before we had the attack, but what am I going to restore that to? I've got to copy it locally again. I've got to mitigate machines on premise and bring that data back, or am I really looking at recovering it directly to cloud servers that can be made available immediately? And that addresses essentially the RTO, or recovery time. How quickly am I operating at a standardized format? And then lastly, at Evolve IP, we've got options that go beyond that into managed DR, where we add in monitoring and comprehensive support to address things not only about how quickly that you come up from an RTO and RPO perspective, but how can you make that actually usable and manageable? Very often we find customers who have a DR plan that involves them getting data up on a server someplace else, but doesn't necessarily address how their end users are going to get to it. It doesn't address networking and DNS and VPNs and authentication credentials. So it's great that I have a server standing up someplace. It's just not inside my network. And that's really part of that kind of comprehensive DR planning at the end. So Evolve IP can support, with our partners who are on this call, anywhere from a premise-based backup all the way up through a fully managed DR and comprehensive report offering. Let's give you a little picture of that design and kind of stepping it up. If you start from, a lot on here, but if you start from backup storage in the box on the left on the on-premises data center, this is really about what you might be taking today. That second box in the previous slide about getting it into multi-sites would be copying that to another box, which we don't have represented here. Moving it off-site on the backup side gives you a long recovery point version of your data from last night or what have you. Not the ability to recover and not multiple points throughout the day. What replication would do next to that on the right is give you a moment-by-moment copy of that data so that your recovery points are increased. And then lastly, if you keep going inside that red circle, that's addressing where you would recover that data to in the offing that you couldn't necessarily recover to the local servers in a timely fashion. And then, of course, what you really need to address, which is what we're representing on the bottom, the people and the machines, is not just getting the data someplace else, but getting your people to it. And that's what a design looks like. So a few key questions for you, and then I'll be about to wrap up. The first really is, how long do you need until you recover? I mean, to this point, we've basically established that ransomware is a people-engineered attack, that it's not targeted directly at you, that the data is prolific on the dark web, and that this really isn't a broken glass style of attack, meaning there's not a lot you can do to prevent, you have to recover. We've talked about potential recovery options in terms of RPO and RTO, point being how to get back before the problem, and time being how quickly can you recover. And that's really what we're asking you to think about here. We used to consider our disaster recovery strategies, how quickly could we recover from a hurricane or a 100-year storm or a tornado. Those things just don't happen that often. But you have the FBI telling you that you're not only have you probably already been hacked, but they want to know when you're going to get attacked the next time. So the question really is not just can you recover, but how long can you afford to not be in your recovery mode? And that's going to differ by business. We're not advocating it needs to be an hour from now in your business, but this really is, if you look at the bottom left of that slide, this is recovery time by strategy to really consider. So what are the points of consideration that we're asking for you all to think about today? This is your checklist. And the further down the slide you go before you deliver yourself a no is really the better off you are, right? Start by challenging yourself. Is my data center backups on separate storage for fast file and system restore? Second, am I copying backups offsite? Third, am I replicating the data offsite with multiple points, journal points over 3 to 5 days? Is that backup and that replication separated in security posture from the live network? If I needed to come back, do I have server infrastructure either on-site and then the cloud to restore to? And that's an interesting question. We oftentimes have customers say, all right, well, I'll back up to your cloud. I have other servers I could restore to, except that you need the time to copy it all back. So give that one some thought. Do you have the ability to test that restoration? How do you know it's going to work? There's lots of things to consider when you're doing the restoral. And then also important and unique, we believe, to Evolve IP from a service provider perspective is the environment that you're failing or backing up to a HIPAA-compliant environment? And then to coin a phrase certainly that we know that you use often in your business, can you provide continuous care of your data and to the users of that data inside your individual businesses and healthcare organizations? So that's our portion of the presentation. I'll be back in a little bit after we talk about some more technical aspects to the solution. And you'll be talking with our partners, both Nimble and Veeam. So at this point, I'm going to pass it over to Virju Patel, who is a senior sales engineer with our partner, Nimble. Virju, you have the floor.
Thanks, Scott. I appreciate your time and everyone else that's joining us today. Hello and thank you. We're talking about this ransomware disrupting healthcare. And as a hospital administrator, patient, it's all about the total customer experience. So, we're going to cover a few topics from the Nimble perspective and all the great tool sets that we use behind the scenes here. So at Nimble Storage, now an HPE company, we see three primary objectives in digital health. Number one being improving operational efficiency, delivering a better clinical outcome, along with enabling a better patient experience. Most focus on the day-to-day operations of infrastructure, alerting, performance, and the healthcare space, but really behind the scenes is when the exterior factor disrupts, whether that be security breaches, ransomware, malware, and so forth. And the only most important thing at that point is how do I get applications back online in the healthcare IT setting, and that can be worrisome. So we at Nimble have been leveraging some really great back-end tool sets, along with leveraging the right partners such as Evolve IP and engineered solutions with Veeam to help prevent, as they happen, how do you get things back in order and very quickly is the premise for today's from my piece here. So those broken into three dimensions are leveraging storage snapshots from a daily protection standpoint, replication strategies both on-prem and local to the cloud, and lastly, and something very unique to Nimble, which is the power of predictive analytics, which is 100% proactive. So with these pieces, at Nimble, we have a maniacal focus on data resiliency and recoverability, and the reduced RPO coincides with all industries that everyone's faced today, especially with healthcare. So we have tool sets such as instantaneous snapshots of critical business systems that you may have that host patient data, PACS data, and so forth. So we'll work closely with partners like Veeam and heavily virtualized space to further our recoverability in place. Typically, in the traditional backup space, you're backing up once a day. So as Scott alluded to earlier, that RPO is not always in the best case of a healthcare operation being 24/7. So when you leverage concepts like storage snapshots, you can really recover instantaneously, and you get to choose your SLA up front. If your original backup strategy today is once a day backups, well, how would that be any different if you had 24 to 48 restore points throughout the day? So when malware hits, you can now chase back in time of the time where you had a golden copy of your data and restore at that point. If the whole site is compromised, that's where the cloud solution becomes very relevant. So how can that be beneficial to the environment with snapshots? You're able to also take clones of your active clinical databases and production systems and perform tests upon them before you actually put them back into production. So this can save a tremendous amount of time on recoveries as well. With the replication and high availability being the most important, we've also further partnered with public cloud providers to provide healthcare DR requirements while abiding by all the HIPAA regulations. And of course, encryption is becoming very important, so we have that ability to secure, encrypt, and replicate as a built-in piece from both Nimble and the providers. So with the cloud conversations upon us, having the alternative route in case a full outage of ransomware occurs or other malware attacks, the private cloud and the public cloud are really great options. Being able to carry cater to the specific needs, you're now able to replicate the protected copy of patient databases to the cloud or multiple clouds for better availability. So as Scott alluded, as Evolve IP, they're a DR as a service provider with high trust publications and certifications. So a great target for healthcare data as an alternative should you need a exterior copy of your data. So we'll briefly discuss ransomware and malware attacks and what do we do next. So having the right ware, having the right tools to recover quickly is very important. But what's really important is the analytics that goes with that. So Nimble pioneered predictive analytics back in 2008. So it's having that back-ended full-time employee effective. If we're data mining across the entire environment, we're able to grab all the information across the stack. So with hospital administrators being stretched to do more with less, predictive analytics has really changed the recovery point objective. So InfoSight is a great avenue in that perspective. I think that does it for my point. If we have any questions at this point, I'll pass it on to Rick Vanover from Veeam.
Well, cheers. Thank you, Virju. And, you know, with this information, I want to kind of break it into a practical sense here, the rule. And when I say the rule, I'm referring to the 3-2-1 rule. You know, we have a lot of technologies, the cloud, storage systems, what we have in our data centers. This 3-2-1 rule is really one way you can navigate the ransomware era successfully. And I'll throw a twist on it here in a second. But I really love this. In fact, we've been talking about this forever, this notion of the 3-2-1 rule, to have 3 different copies of your data on 2 different media, with one of which being off-site. Now, the beautiful thing about this rule is that it doesn't require any specific technology. In fact, it's a really good way to leverage the cloud. It's a really good way to leverage the storage systems you have, like storage snapshots. In fact, the Nimble example is a really good way for both production and secondary storage. So this notion of having a storage snapshot is a really good way to address this different media. But this rule of having 3 different copies of your important data on 2 different media, one of which being off-site, doesn't require any specific hardware, yet can address almost any failure scenario. So that's really important today, because when we think about the governance that goes along with healthcare data and with the responsibilities we have with it, we really need to have an availability perspective. So this notion of the 3-2-1 rule, just a little bit more specifically, really can take this data from the data center to a disk system and then put it into other places like the cloud, on tape, or on a different disk system as well. Now, tape, this is 2017, but you know, when you think about the offline attribute, you know, that it's really hard to challenge that. But I have a preference myself for cloud and disk systems with really good thought to the design and how that communication is accessed. What you don't want to have is your backup infrastructure being a way to propagate. So the cloud is a completely different authentication. The disk systems can be as well. We just want to make sure we have as many layers of separation as possible. So I love this 3-2-1 rule because it really is versatile. Now, the other thing to note about the 3-2-1 rule is that you can add a twist to it, and that's this notion of the 3-2-1-0 rule, and that's the 0 errors, right? What you don't want to have is a situation where you have a ransomware incident and you go to restore data and you find it is not as you would expect. It's not usable, and you have to go back. You have to go older to a older restore point or something like that. The issue with that is that you're decreasing the availability of the data and you're increasing the response time to an incident like that. So one particular technology that can really help you with this is the notion of having 0 errors with your backup data. Veeam has pioneered this technology called Sure Backup that will verify the recoverability of your virtual machines that can be taken from a backup or from a storage snapshot. So in the Nimble example, this is a really good one that we can actually verify from a storage snapshot that what we will be backing up will be working and restore as we would expect. Really powerful stuff. And you can also use this as a framework to test things, like test a critical update in your data center, because that's important too. You don't want to go make a planned change on something and then have something not go as expected and then have to do it again another time. Tell me you haven't seen that happen. This is technology that can help you. But when things go wrong, what we want to do in the situation of when ransomware hits is have options, and there are a lot of options, where if we have an infectious zone on the virtual machines, and you know, it isn't just a PC problem, it can happen in the data center as well with ransomware. We want to have many ways out of this problem. We want to have our backups. We want to have storage snapshots. We want to have backups on a dedupe appliance like in an archive state. We want to have stuff on tape. We want to have a mechanism before we even restore this data that we can verify that it'll come back without having the ransomware. This notion of having the on-demand sandbox and going into a restore situation knowing that it has already been verified to be recoverable, this is a really powerful way to address these situations that are indeed just a matter of time before they happen. Now, the other side of this is, moving data around, and this is a specific Veeam example, but there's this notion of the backup copy job, and I love the backup copy job, but what it really does is solve the problem of getting data off-site. It can also do it in a very granular way, where different data chunks or systems in regards to their backups are moved into their respective location off-site, and this can also be in the cloud. Now, there's this notion of Cloud Connect, which I'll talk about here in a second, but we can take the same motion of the data and move it off-site into a cloud target. Now, in regards to cloud, it's a technology that we've had out for a while called Veeam Cloud Connect that leverages service providers around the world, and you can even ensure that your data won't leave a certain country, which is important with this type of data. But the important thing to note is this is basically extending your backup infrastructure to the cloud. And this is a really powerful way to get this availability experience in new places. So when we take this example specifically for Veeam Cloud Connect, there's this notion of a service provider that will hold our backups with this notion of a cloud gateway, which is basically going to receive the data, and then we'll have customer 1, 2, 3, and 4 from a multi-tenant standpoint separated, but the one that this one cares about would be customer 2, for example. And when we move this data specifically to our slice of that cloud infrastructure, we can do so with confidence. And the important thing to note is that this is done with what I call BYOE. So the end user will bring your own encryption. So they can put this backup data in the cloud confidently with their own encryption, knowing that it can only be decrypted with the mechanisms on premises, yet you can get that offsite backup. And it's a completely different authentication framework to get up into that cloud. Now, what do you do when we have an option to restore? It's, reduce that time. So again, I love the notion of leveraging storage systems. The Nimble example is a great one. We have integration with the primary storage. For Nimble snapshots, we can take backups very easily. We can restore very quickly. But then when we think of the broader capability, this notion of granular recovery is very important. Maybe I just need a file. Maybe I need files from this folder. Maybe I had a containment of an issue. Knowing where we can bring these data points back, whether it be from a storage snapshot, which will be really quick, both in how long it takes to recover, but it's also really short in how old that data is. Because it's also important to note, the older the data is that you go to restore, really the less usable it is. So the notion of an old RPO, nobody wants that. They want data as recent as possible. We have a lot of options to do that with HPE, from the store once device, or possibly from tape with store ever, and then also to possibly a second site or a tape storage or a service provider in the cloud. All of that being said, there's options with Veeam, and I'll turn it back over to go to the next segment here with a case study.
Thanks so much. Appreciate that. And just quickly, we just wanted to wrap with a quick case study, and then sort of recap, and then we'll be opening it up for questions. And these are obviously oversimplified, but I mean, in the first case study, where ransomware lives, where the attack is alive, is when we've got a ransomware attack in an environment that has an on-premise backup on the same storage as production, maybe has a backup copy in an off-site data center, but hasn't really considered the restoral infrastructure. Whether, as was just mentioned in the Veeam portion, that is a local appliance or a cloud appliance. The discussion about the speed to recover in the environment, which to recover to, is really at question. So none in this case. No means to access those servers that are actually being restored to. Not a HIPAA compliant environment, not a high trust audited environment. And the response really is potential corruption of backup, systems are the same as production, very slow recovery. So even if the files were able to be recovered, that RTO we were talking about, recovery time objective, is really going to be pushed out, frankly, by the speed of the WAN, by the speed of the internet. If it's in the cloud and only in the cloud without a cloud recovery or a local appliance that it's keeping in sync. Hours, potentially days to rebuild that environment. Design and configuration of desktops, access, firewall, VPNs all need to be reconsidered and repointed. And then the customer's not compliant for a period of time, aside from just being down. Now, if you move on to what we're considering calling it dead, what we've really got here is an attack via a compromised email account. This customer had backup, replication, and recoverable servers in the cloud for the entire environment, or maybe even on site, depending on how things were structured at the customer storage scenario. The analysis is done to identify the best recovery point based on replication journals. Within 90 minutes, the client's customer environment is restored to the appropriate point in time. Users are able to access the environment immediately. Restoration back to the primary data center over time, which we can get to if there's further questions on. And maximum data recovery with minimal business disruption and users accessing a new production environment is ultimately what we're going for. Now, at the end of the day, your RTO and your RPO is really based on your business's risk and your propensity to invest in the insurance IT expenditure related to keep those two items in control. So if we summarize, all of this hinges up to the fact that ransomware is a no broken glass found kind of attack. We've got volumes of credentials that are available on the dark web. This is a clear and present danger. This is a now, right? People are the biggest risk. We talked about phishing scams, similar passwords. There's really no way to secure this with technology. Your stance needs to be, in many ways, reactive. Stolen credentials are certainly the easiest path in. We shared how those attacks are increasing exponentially. And as we said, really a strategy for this, and this is Evolve IP strategy, as we advise our customers proactively. Proactive threat intelligence means monitoring for vulnerabilities, educating your employees. Being active in your security management means appropriate care and feeding of your systems. As was mentioned earlier, this was the primary reason that WannaCry got so crazy. It was people and unpatched systems at the end of the day. Ongoing awareness in the business and in the IT department, and then really what you need to develop together with Evolve IP, with your own vendors, with Veeam, with ID Agent, all of the vendors that have been involved here today, is what is your strong reactive posture? What is your incident response capability? You need to secure your offsite backup and replicated data. You need to consider your ability to recover from multiple points in time, not just last night or the day before. You need to plan for business continuity. We're done talking about disaster recovery. You have to have a disaster recovery plan, but we all know that hurricanes and 100-year floods are going to be a whole hell of a lot less frequent than this challenge, right? And then for all of you here in the HIMSS community, there's got to be the consideration around compliance. So the end goal here is, for both you and your day-to-day business and in your IT operations, is continuity of care. So just to tie everybody together, I want to mention that Evolve IP is a HIPAA-compliant and high-trust audited cloud. We are a Veeam Platinum Cloud Service provider. We participate in the Cloud Connect program, and that if you were leveraging a local Veeam infrastructure to back up your local hypervisors, you would be able to also leverage backing that up directly to Evolve IP. We're a Nimble Elite partner and leverage them extensively in our multiple global cloud centers throughout the world. And then, again, ransomware is dead. The idea behind killing ransomware is when your data is easily and quickly recoverable from multiple points in time in a compliant environment, you can truly kill the ransomware risk inside your business. So with that, we're going to turn it back to Beth, I believe, for Q&A at this point.
Yep, and thanks so much. I have some speaker-specific questions to start out with, and I would encourage all of our listeners to start logging their questions in the Q&A window while we go through these first few speaker-specific questions. So we'll start with one for Scott Kinka. Scott, question. If I do a recovery in the cloud, how do I get the data back on premises?
Great question, and I'll answer it in two ways. First of all, the recovery is going to be based on what your business continuity strategy is on the way out. So there's a couple different paths. Obviously, if it was an exclusive cloud-based backup and recovery type of solution, you'd fail back in the same way that you essentially seeded the cloud in the first place, which is you'd live in the cloud-based environment until you were able to restore production to local servers, and then you'd essentially reverse replicate or reverse seed back down to the local premise. That could take some time depending on where the data scenario is. Now, Rick, if you want to jump in on this as well, another way certainly that many of our customers use is they're backing up to a local Veeam appliance and then backing that up to the cloud, so that there's the option to recover to the cloud or the option to recover back from the local appliance into production. And that choice is really going to be based on the extent of the condition of the problem.
Okay.
Yeah, nothing to add there other than, having the proximity of the data to where you need to restore it. That's really important in regards to restore time, and having it on both ends gives you the best of both worlds.
And just a question for all of you on that same note. It seems backups seem like such a given. How could you not realize that your organization needs backups? But how many organizations do all of you run into who either don't see it as essential, didn't know it was essential, or didn't have it and got hit?
I
hear a chuckle, so I'm sensing that you all have experienced this.
Yeah. I would say we rarely, from a Vault IT perspective, we rarely run into people who don't have backup. But I will say, and you saw that sort of in our active management portion, the same people who are largely not caring and feeding for systems from a patching perspective are the people who really haven't tested the validity of their backup strategy. Meaning there's a tape, but nobody's really looked at or tested the ability to recover from it. And, tape media degrades over time. So we've run into oftentimes cases where, hey, I had a backup, what's wrong with it, is the question.
So fair to say that the backup is more than a physical piece of machinery or a device. The backup then should also include testing of protocols and sort of dress rehearsals of protocols when it comes to a breach and dealing with the aftermath. The backup really isn't just the device.
Without question.
Okay. Moving on, a question for Kevin Lancaster. Kevin, how do I find out what kind of vulnerabilities my company actually has? What's the best way to go about that?
I'm assuming that's relative to what's out there on the dark web. One, I wouldn't suggest going out there and on network downloading Tor browsers and trying to navigate, figure out, how to pull the data. I mean, there are firms like us and others that specialize in finding specific data tied to specific organizations or looking for chatter on specific groups or specific tactics or activities. And so if somebody wants to send me a note offline, I'd be happy to kind of peel through those. But in general, it's not something that we would recommend doing. It's going out there and openly trying to configure a Tor browser and access these areas, because often just downloading these browsers can be detrimental to the network and expose data that don't want to expose. So anybody that has specific questions, I'd certainly be glad to follow up offline on that.
Okay. And
I'm going to jump in real quickly. This is Dave McChrystal from Evolve IP. One of the items that we've offered to the attendees for today is to get a dark web analysis run if they're interested. So if there's anyone out there who does have that curiosity, we'll send a message out to everyone based on their registration information, and they can respond and say that they're interested in doing that, and we'll be happy to run a quick analysis and give them a kind of a snapshot view of what type of information is out there on the dark web.
Okay. And for Rick Vanover, Rick, how often are you seeing customers get hit by ransomware attacks?
Oh, goodness. Well, we see it likely every day. And when I say we, I'm referring to Veeam tech support. In fact, we've even adjusted how it is addressed from our support operations standpoint. It goes into our SWAT team, which is in between a Tier 1 and Tier 2, because they really need to resolve this immediately. But basically, we see it basically every day, and the real takeaway here is that it's not just a PC problem. This is absolutely in the data center. Sure, the entry point may be from emails and user training and all, but the resolution is via backup, and the impacted areas are in the data center. So, but generally speaking, we see it every day.
And that definitely falls in line with a lot of data and studies that are coming out that the healthcare industry was the most attacked in the last year, and that more alarmingly that we see ransomware as a problem that's only going to get worse. Anybody who wants to pile on to that question and just add their perspective, go right ahead. But that's certainly what we're hearing.
No, it matches what we're seeing as well.
Yeah. And just a final question, knowing what challenges the industry is facing as far as ransomware and evolving threats as well, where does software need to go to meet those challenges? I mean, you guys said, people are always, one of, if not the biggest vulnerability, but where does software need to go in the coming years to sort of meet the challenges that you all are seeing coming up? Anyone can start.
Well, I would just say it has to be hybrid available, and you really have to do a data flow analysis from the backup perspective. Backup is not a checkbox anymore, so that's my perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I think that the industry as a whole had been tracing, the 0-day type of attack methodology for a long time. 0-day being the time between when a particular format of an attack is released and the time that the industry tools are written to be able to account for it. Most of the damage is done during 0-day, during 0 hour, which is why I think everyone involved in this, as well as the FBI and some of the other people that we quoted here, is advising that this is probably less of a software challenge, because we know there's not a lot we can do from an attack signature perspective during that early period, and it's really about making sure that recovery is there. So, Rick, I would completely agree with your statement there.
Okay, well, that's all I have. Does anybody have any comments or anything else they'd like to add before we close the discussion?
You want to mention No, I think the only thing that we want to mention, this is Scott from Evolve IP. Thank you all for attending today. This was a great session. I want to thank ID Agent and Nimble Storage and Veeam, as well as the team at HIMSS for helping coordinate everything today. We will be, as Dave had mentioned, be sending some communication out to the attendees related to, first of all, our offer to do a little bit of an exploration of the dark web on your behalf, and to reach out about opportunities to leverage both Evolve and all the great vendors and folks that you heard from today. So be on the lookout for that, and we really appreciate your time.
All right. Well, thank you to all of you for lending us your perspective and your expertise today. We really appreciate you taking the time and spending some time with us on this particular topic. Just a note that today's session will be available on demand until September 13th. And thank you again for joining us today.